Imagine a city gripped by a fear so profound. It was more tangible than the winter chill off Lake Michigan. This was not a fear of supernatural beasts or mythical creatures, but of a man, a king who ruled not from a throne, but from a backroom table in a smoky speakeasy. His court filled not with nobles, but with killers in silk suits. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, but the world would come to know him by a title whispered in dread and spoken in headlines, the Godfather of Chicago. The story you are about to hear is a journey into the very heart of this American darkness, a meticulously reconstructed account of ambition, violence, and ultimate downfall. It is crucial to state, right at the outset, that this narrative has been pieced together from a multitude of historical sources, court transcripts, newspaper archives from the era, biographies of the key players, and declassified government documents. Our mission is singular and clear: to deliver to you, the listener, the most accurate and comprehensive information, separating the compelling facts from the pervasive myths that have grown around this figure over the decades. This is a true crime story in its most raw and unflinching form. So, find a comfortable space. Let the distractions of the world fade away and prepare to be transported back in time. But before we step into the past, if you are a seeker of such deep historical truths, if stories of power and its consequences resonate with you, then consider subscribing to this channel. We are dedicated to unearthing these narratives for you, and your support ensures that the journey into history continues. Now, with that essential context and call to action laid out, we begin at the very beginning, in a place far from the towering skyline of Chicago, in the crowded, noisy, and hopeful immigrant quarters of Brooklyn, New York. The year was 1899, and the place was a cramped tenement building at 95 Navy Street, a world defined by struggle and the relentless pursuit of a better life. This was the world into which Alphonse Capone was born on January 17th to Gabriel and Teresina Capone, two immigrants from the impoverished village of Castellammare di Stabia near Naples in Italy. They were part of a great wave of Italian immigrants who arrived on American shores carrying little more than their dreams and a formidable work ethic. Gabriel was a barber by trade and Teresina a seamstress, and together they navigated the harsh realities of their new world, raising their children in an environment where every penny was earned through sweat and sacrifice. Al was the fourth of 9 children, and from his earliest days, he was immersed in a cacophony of languages. The Neapolitan dialect of his parents at home, the rough and tumble English of the Brooklyn streets outside. The neighborhood was a melting pot of Irish, Jewish, and Italian families, all jostling for their piece of the American dream. And it was on these streets that young Al received his primary education. He was, by all accounts, a bright and capable student, attending public school 7 and even showing promise. But the structured, disciplined environment of the classroom could not compete with the vibrant, if dangerous, lessons of the avenue. The street offered a different curriculum, one in which respect was taken, not given, where a quick mind was as valuable as a strong fist, and where loyalty to your own was the highest law. It was here he joined his first gangs, youthful bands with names like the Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors, where he learned the fundamentals of petty crime, shoplifting, running errands for older criminals, and understanding the intricate social hierarchy of the underworld. This was his true schooling, and he proved an adept and eager student, graduating from minor mischief to more serious employment while still in his early teens. A pivotal figure entered Capone's life during these formative Brooklyn years, a man named Johnny Torrio. Torrio was a significant figure in the New York underworld, a lieutenant to the powerful gangster Paulie Kelly, but he was unlike the stereotypical thug of the era. He was quiet, thoughtful, and impeccably dressed, a strategist who believed that crime should be run like a business, with minimal violence and maximum profit. Torrio operated a series of gambling dens and saw in the young, brash, and intelligent Al Capone a useful asset. He became an unofficial mentor, imparting lessons that would shape Capone's entire philosophy. The importance of cultivating political and police connections, the value of offering a service the public craved, and the strategic use of intimidation over outright bloodshed whenever possible. Capone, who had a quick temper, learned from Torrio the power of a calm demeanor. However, this criminal apprenticeship was violently interrupted by an event that would brand him for life. While working as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn, a seedy bar and brothel on Coney Island owned by another gangster, Frankie Yale, the 17-year-old Capone made a grave mistake. He made an indecent remark to a young woman at the bar, who turned out to be the sister of a local hoodlum named Frank Galusio. Galusio, enraged, confronted Capone and, in the ensuing fight, slashed him 3 times across the left cheek with a knife. The wounds were deep and left permanent, highly visible scars. It was from this brutal attack that the nickname Scarface was born. Capone, deeply ashamed of the marks, which he considered a sign of a low-class street brawl, would later concoct a story that he had received them while fighting in the famous Los Battalion during the Great War in France. But the truth was far more revealing. These scars were a permanent physical manifestation of the brutal world he inhabited, a world from which he was determined to rise, not as a mere soldier, but as its general. This incident, while physically and psychologically scarring, did not derail his trajectory. If anything, it hardened him, and when the call came from his mentor Torrio, who had moved to a city of unparalleled opportunity, Capone was ready to leave Brooklyn behind and step onto a much larger stage. That city was Chicago, a place on the verge of a tectonic shift, a shift that a man like Al Capone was perfectly positioned to exploit. The city that Johnny Torrio summoned Al Capone to in 1919 was a roaring, seething cauldron of industry, ambition, and corruption, a place perfectly engineered for the ascent of a man with a particular set of skills. Chicago in the early 20th century was the quintessential American boomtown, a magnet for immigrants and fortune seekers. But beneath its gleaming surface of progress lay a deep and festering rot within its political and police institutions. This systemic corruption was the fertile ground in which organized crime would not just grow, but flourish with an audacity unimaginable anywhere else. Torrio, with his strategic mind, had seen the future, and the future was prohibition. The Volstead Act was on the horizon, a piece of legislation born from a well-intentioned but naive movement to cure the nation's social ills by banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages for the average citizen. It was an inconvenience or a moral victory for men like Torrio and his new lieutenant, the freshly arrived 20-year-old Al Capone. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was a government-mandated creation of a multi-billion-dollar black market, a gift to the underworld that would dwarf all previous criminal enterprises combined. Torrio was already working for his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, the city's foremost vice lord who ran a vast empire of brothels and gambling. Colosimo, a flamboyant and self-indulgent man, was initially skeptical of the potential in bootlegging, seeing it as a passing fad. This short-sightedness created a fatal rift between him and his ambitious nephew. Torrio, recognizing that Colosimo was a relic of a bygone era, knew that to seize the moment, a change in leadership was necessary. In May 1920, just a few months after Prohibition began, Big Jim Colosimo was assassinated, gunned down in the foyer of his own restaurant. Though never convicted, it is widely believed that Torrio and Capone orchestrated the hit with Frankie Yale, the man from Capone's own scarring incident, imported from New York to do the deed. With Colosimo removed, the path was clear. Torrio took over the empire and, with Capone as his ruthless and energetic right-hand man, began the monumental task of organizing Chicago's thirst. Capone's rise under Torrio's wing was meteoric. He was no longer just a Brooklyn hoodlum. He was a key executive in the largest illicit corporation in the Midwest. Torrio, the brilliant CEO, devised a grand plan, the outfit. His vision was to end the costly and chaotic territorial wars between the city's myriad gangs by creating a syndicate, a cartel that would divide the city into distinct territories and coordinate the bootlegging business with the efficiency of a major corporation. It was a revolutionary concept in American crime. Capone was instrumental in enforcing this peace, his reputation for swift and brutal violence serving as a powerful deterrent to any who would challenge Torrio's authority. He was given control of the suburb of Cicero, a move of strategic genius. Cicero was a separate municipality, just outside Chicago's borders, with its own, more easily corruptible police force and political structure. Capone turned this town into his personal fiefdom, a wide, open city where speakeasies and breweries operated in plain sight. He ensured his chosen candidates won local elections through a campaign of unprecedented intimidation and violence on Election Day in 1924, where his men patrolled polling stations, beating opponents, stuffing ballot boxes, and terrorizing voters into submission. Once his men were in office, Cicero became a safe haven, the industrial heart of the Torrio, Capone bootlegging operation. It was here that Capone began to cultivate his public persona. He became a local celebrity, a benefactor. He could be seen dining in fine restaurants, always impeccably dressed in expensive, tailored suits, his diamond pinky ring glinting, his smile, when he chose to flash it, surprisingly charming. He presented himself as a businessman, merely providing a service that the public demanded. He understood public relations in a way no gangster before him had, donating to charities, opening soup kitchens during the Great Depression, and always telling reporters that he was just a businessman supplying a public demand. He became a paradox, a beloved rogue, a criminal folk hero in the eyes of many who were disillusioned with the hypocrisy of Prohibition and the corrupt establishment. But this carefully constructed image of the benevolent businessman was a thin veneer, and it was about to be shattered by a storm of violence that would cement his name in the annals of infamy, a violence that began with a direct challenge to his own mentor and boss, Johnny Torrio. The fragile piece engineered by Johnny Torrio's syndicate system was not destined to last. The very nature of the immense profits at stake made conflict inevitable, and the challenge came from the north side of Chicago, a territory controlled by a charismatic and ambitious Irish, German gangster named Dean O'Banion. O'Banion was everything Torrio was not. He was flamboyant, loud, unpredictable, and possessed a volatile temper that chafed against the structured, corporate approach of the outfit. The tension between the two factions was a slow burning fuse, and the spark was lit over a territorial dispute involving a lucrative brewing operation. O'Banion, feeling cornered and disrespected, made a fatal miscalculation. He orchestrated a complex ruse that involved selling his flagship operation, the Sebin Brewery, to Torrio and Capone. The deal was set to be finalized on a specific day, but O'Banion, having inside information from his corrupt police contacts, knew that the brewery was scheduled for a police raid the following day. Torrio and Capone, unaware of the setup, paid a small fortune for the brewery, only to have it seized by the authorities almost immediately after the transaction was complete. Torrio, the calm strategist, was infuriated by this betrayal, viewing it as a profound breach of their criminal code. For Capone, it was a personal insult and a direct challenge to their authority that could not be allowed to stand. If O'Banion could humiliate them so publicly and get away with it, every other gang in the city would be emboldened to do the same. The decision was made. Dean O'Banion had to be eliminated. The task, however, had to be carried out with precision. O'Banion was a notoriously wary man, always surrounded by bodyguards. The only place he ever let his guard down was in his own flower shop, a business he owned and operated as a cover, where he fancied himself a skilled florist, arranging bouquets for the very funerals of the gangsters he often helped to create. On the morning of November 10, 1924, as O'Banion was preparing a floral arrangement, 3 men he recognized as associates from the Jenna Brothers gang, another Italian outfit, entered his shop. As O'Banion reached out to shake the hand of one of the men, the other 2 drew pistols and shot him multiple times at point-blank range. The assassination was clean, efficient, and sent a shockwave through the city. It was the opening salvo in what the newspapers would soon dub the Beer Wars. a bloody conflict for control of Chicago's soul. The murder of Dean O'Banion did not bring peace. It unleashed a firestorm of retaliation that would consume the city for years. O'Banion's North Side gang was now led by the ruthless duo of Earl, Hemi Wace and George, Bugs, Moron, both of whom were fiercely loyal to their slain leader and burning with a desire for vengeance. Their first and primary target was Johnny Torrio, the man they believed had ordered the hit. In January 1925, they found their opportunity. As Torrio returned to his apartment building with his wife after a shopping trip, Wace and Moron ambushed him. Moron shot Torrio at close range, the bullet striking him in the chest. As Torrio lay on the ground, Weiss stepped forward and fired a shot directly into his face at point-blank range. Miraculously, Torrio survived, but the experience fundamentally broke him. The calm, calculating businessman of crime had looked death in the eye and wanted no more of it. After a brief period of recovery and a short jail sentence for the earlier Sebin Brewery raid, Torrio made a momentous decision. He summoned Al Capone, and in a quiet meeting, he ceded total control of his entire criminal empire to his young protégé. He then took a substantial portion of his wealth, returned to New York, and eventually retired to Italy, leaving the bloody battlefield of Chicago behind forever. At the age of 26, Al Capone was now the undisputed boss of the outfit, the sole king of a multimillion-dollar empire built on beer and blood. This transition of power marked a significant shift in the tone of organized crime in the city. Where Torrio had been a quiet consolidator who preferred backroom deals, Capone was a brash, high-profile emperor who believed in ruling through a combination of overwhelming force and public spectacle. He moved his base of operations from the relative obscurity of Cicero to the very heart of Chicago, establishing his headquarters at the legendary Lexington Hotel at 22nd and Michigan, which he dubbed the Fortress. From this command post, surrounded by a small army of bodyguards, secretaries, and accountants, he would oversee his vast and growing domain, a domain that was now under constant and violent siege from the vengeful North Side gang, a conflict that was escalating towards an unprecedented level of public carnage that would shock the entire nation and forever define the era of Prohibition. With the mantle of absolute power now resting squarely on his shoulders, Al Capone embarked on a period of unprecedented expansion and consolidation, transforming the outfit from a powerful Chicago syndicate into a national criminal corporation with tendrils reaching into every facet of American illicit life. His reign began with a declaration of war, not just against the remnants of the North Side gang, but against any and all who dared to challenge his authority. The years from 1925 to 1929 were the zenith of Capone's power, a period where he operated with a brazenness that blurred the line between gangster and celebrity. His headquarters at the Lexington Hotel became a nerve center of criminal activity, a place where politicians, policemen, and judges were seen coming and going, their pockets lined with Capone's cash, their allegiances purchased to ensure his operations ran with impunity. He lived a life of garish, public opulence, a calculated performance designed to project an image of invincibility. He traveled in a custom-built, armor-plated limousine with a police siren, a rolling fortress that was a symbol of his power on the city's streets. He held court in popular restaurants, surrounded by a retinue of bodyguards, dispensing $100 tips and holding forth with reporters, whom he charmed with his crude but compelling wit. He became a constant feature in the newspapers, which fed the public's seemingly insatiable appetite for stories about the charismatic Scarface. He understood the power of the media intuitively and used it to craft his narrative, often portraying himself as a misunderstood businessman and a benefactor of the common man. During the harsh winter of 1929, as the Great Depression began to strangle the nation, he opened a soup kitchen in Chicago that served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to thousands of unemployed and destitute Americans. The publicity was priceless to the average person struggling to survive. Al Capone was a more visible and effective source of aid than the distant and seemingly indifferent federal government. This benevolent public image, however, was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of his business dealings. His bootlegging empire was a complex, vertically integrated operation. He controlled the breweries and distilleries, hidden in plain sight in warehouses and industrial districts. He managed the distribution networks of trucks that moved the alcohol under the cover of night, often protected by police escorts paid for with bribes, and he supplied hundreds of speakeasies across the city and the suburbs, from the most glamorous clubs frequented by high society to the dingiest basement bars. But his empire extended far beyond alcohol. He muscled in on the unions, taking control of key industries like cleaning and dyeing, and he established a near total monopoly on prostitution in the areas he controlled, overseeing a vast network of brothels that generated immense revenue. Gambling was another cornerstone, with massive, luxurious casinos operating openly in Cicero, bringing in fortunes from patrons eager to try their luck. This was the golden age of Capone's rule, a time when he seemed untouchable, a criminal king whose power rivaled, and in many cases surpassed, that of the city's legitimate government. But this very supremacy was breeding resentment and fear, not only among his rivals, but within the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., where a small group of federal agents were beginning to plot a new kind of attack, one that Capone's army of corrupt politicians and policemen would be powerless to stop. The war with the North Side Gang, now firmly under the control of the relentless and cunning Himmy Weiss, intensified into a city-wide terror campaign, a series of ambushes and drive-by shootings that turned Chicago's streets into a war zone. Weiss was as determined as Capone, and arguably more patient in his pursuit of vengeance for Dean O'Banion. The conflict reached a fever pitch in 1926, on September 20. Weiss orchestrated what can only be described as a military-style assault on Capone's headquarters at the Lexington Hotel. In a meticulously planned operation, Weiss and his men commandeered several buildings across the street from the hotel. They positioned themselves in windows, armed with a small arsenal of machine guns, shotguns, and rifles. As Capone was dining inside, the world outside his window erupted in a hailstorm of lead. The assailants unleashed over 1,000 rounds into the hotel's facade, shattering windows, ripping through walls, and sending patrons and staff diving for cover. Miraculously, Capone was unharmed, but the message was chillingly clear: nowhere was safe. The brazen attack. In the middle of the day, in the heart of the city, demonstrated a level of audacity that shocked even the jaded citizens of Chicago. It was a direct challenge to Capone's perceived invincibility, and he knew that a response of overwhelming and terrifying force was required. He could not be seen as weak. The retaliation was swift. Just a month later, on October 11, 1926, Himy Weiss was ambushed and machined, gunned to death on the steps of the Holy Name Cathedral, a place of worship just a few feet from O'Banion's old flower shop. The assassination was a masterpiece of underworld execution, eliminating Capone's most persistent and dangerous enemy. With Weiss gone, leadership of the North Side gang fell to George "Bugs" Moran, a brutish and less strategic gangster who harbored an even deeper, more personal hatred for Capone. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had decisively shifted. Capone had survived the most direct attempt on his life and had eliminated his most capable rival. He now stood at the very apex of his power, the undisputed master of the Chicago underworld, a king who had secured his throne with blood and iron. But in his moment of supreme victory, he was already sowing the seeds of his own destruction. For the sheer scale of his violence was creating a backlash that would eventually mobilize the full force of the United States government against him, a force that would not rest until the King of Chicago was dethroned. The elimination of Himy Weiss did not bring the peace Capone may have hoped for. It merely changed the character of his conflict with the North Side. George "Bugs" Moran, now in charge, was a man of coarser metal than the strategic Weiss. He was a brawler, a man driven by a visceral hatred for Capone that made him unpredictable and persistently annoying. While the large-scale, military-style assaults diminished, the city remained a tinderbox of simmering violence, with sporadic shootings, bombings of rival breweries, and kidnappings of key personnel becoming the new normal. It was against this backdrop of a protracted, grinding conflict that Capone, in a move of either staggering hubris or calculated public relations, decided to step onto the national stage in a way no gangster ever had before. In 1929, at the height of his power and with a nationwide reputation as public enemy number one, he accepted an invitation to be interviewed by a journalist from the Philadelphia Bulletin. This was not a quick comment on the street. It was a formal, sit-down interview. But the location he chose was telling. Not his fortress at the Lexington Hotel, but his lavish 22-room suite at the Presidential Arms in Miami Beach, Florida. Capone had begun spending increasing amounts of time in Florida, purchasing an extensive waterfront estate in Palm Island, which he fortified and turned into a Southern command post. Far from the bitter Chicago winters and the immediate threats of Moran's gunmen, the interview was a masterclass in image crafting. Dressed in a light silk suit, sipping drinks, and surrounded by opulence, Capone presented himself not as a vicious gangster, but as a misunderstood public servant. He famously stated, "I call myself a businessman. I make my money by supplying a popular demand. If I break the law, my customers are as guilty as I am." He blamed the violence on the conditions created by Prohibition itself and on the refusal of his rivals to cooperate with his vision of a peaceful syndicate. He portrayed himself as a man of peace, forced into violence to protect his interests and his life. He even claimed he spent most of his time trying to dodge bullets, not order shootings. "My rackets are run on strictly American lines," he declared, opting the language of corporate America to legitimize his empire. The interview was syndicated across the country, and the public response was divided. To some, he was a chilling embodiment of lawlessness. To others, he was a charismatic anti-hero, speaking a truth about the hypocrisy of Prohibition that resonated deeply. This very public relations campaign, however, was a double-edged sword. While it may have won him a measure of popular sympathy, it also infuriated the federal government. To officials in Washington, particularly a stern, incorruptible Secretary of the Treasury named Andrew Mellon, Capone was no folk hero. He was a national disgrace, a symbol of the government's failure to enforce its own laws. His very public flaunting of his wealth and power was a direct challenge to their authority. It was around this time that Mellon made a quiet but momentous decision. He directed his top law enforcement official, a determined and methodical lawyer named Elmer Eyre, the head of the Treasury's enforcement branch, to find a way to put Al Capone in prison. They knew they could never convict him for murder or bootlegging. The local corruption and witness intimidation were too complete. But they had a new, seemingly mundane weapon: tax evasion. The premise was simple. Capone lived like a multimillionaire king. He had to be earning an immense income. And yet, there was no record that he had ever filed a federal income tax return. If they could prove he had a massive, untaxed income, they could send him to prison on a federal charge, far from the reach of his bought judges and politicians in Chicago. The hunt was on, and it would be led not by flashy men with Tommy guns, but by a team of quiet, bespectacled accountants armed with ledgers and subpoenas. While the accountants began their painstaking work, the blood feud with Bugs Moran was about to erupt in a final, catastrophic explosion of violence that would forever sear the name Al Capone into the American consciousness with a new, more terrifying brand of infamy. The trigger was a dispute over a shipment of hijacked Canadian whiskey, a high-stakes theft that represented a significant financial loss for the outfit. Moran, never one for subtlety, had bragged about the hijacking, openly mocking Capone's inability to protect his own shipments. For Capone, this was the final straw. Moran had to be dealt with permanently, not just as a business rival, but as a personal insult that could not be tolerated. The plan that was conceived was one of breathtaking audacity and cold-blooded ruthlessness. It was designed not just to kill Moran, but to annihilate his entire leadership structure in one single, terrifying blow. The scheme was a masterpiece of deception. A key element involved luring Moran's top men to a specific location under a believable pretext. The location chosen was the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street, which served as Moran's primary headquarters for his bootlegging operations. The pretext was a bargain deal on a shipment of hijacked Canadian whiskey, an offer too good for Moran to refuse. On the morning of February 14, 1929, say Valentine's Day, Moran and his key lieutenants were scheduled to be at the garage to receive the shipment. Capone, crucially, made sure he was far away, holding very public meetings at his Palm Island estate in Miami, establishing a perfect, if transparent, alibi. The execution of the plan was left to his most trusted lieutenants. On that cold, gray morning, 7 of Moran's men were inside the garage. They included his best enforcers, his brother-in-law, and his top business managers, the very heart of the North Side gang's operational capacity. At around 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac, similar to those used by the Chicago Police Department, pulled up outside. 4 men got out. 2 were in police uniforms, and 2 were in civilian clothes. They entered the garage. The men inside, thinking it was a routine police raid, compliantly lined up against the back wall, as was standard procedure. They were then mercilessly executed with submachine guns and shotguns fired at close range by the men in civilian clothes, while the men in police uniforms stood watch. The scene they left behind was one of unimaginable carnage. 6 of the 7 men were killed instantly. A 7th, Frank Gusenberg, despite being shot 22 times, was still alive when real police arrived, but he refused to identify his killers before dying hours later. Bugs Moran himself had narrowly escaped death, running late that morning. He had seen the police-looking car arrive, and thinking it was a raid, had fled the scene. When he heard the news, he reportedly said, "Only Capone kills like that." The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it was instantly dubbed by the press, was a tactical success for Capone. It had decapitated his primary rival's organization. But strategically, it was a disaster of epic proportions. The sheer brutality of the massacre, the use of police uniforms, the execution-style killings in broad daylight created a national uproar of horror and revulsion. The public image of the charming, benevolent gangster that Capone had so carefully cultivated was instantly shattered, replaced by the monstrous visage of a cold, blooded mass murderer. The event turned the full force of public opinion and federal resolve against him. The quiet work of Elmer Irie's accountants was no longer just a financial investigation. It had become a national crusade to bring a monster to justice. The immediate aftermath of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a city gripped by a silence more deafening than any gunfight, a collective shock that permeated every level of Chicago society. The brazenness of the killings, the desecration of a holiday associated with love, and the cold, assembly line efficiency of the murders had crossed an invisible line. For the first time, the general public, which had often viewed the gang wars with a degree of morbid fascination or wary acceptance, felt a genuine and profound sense of terror. The front, front-page photographs of the blood-spattered garage wall. The detailed descriptions of the victims' bodies turned Al Capone from a folk hero into a civic nightmare. The press, which had once played along with his self-crafted image, now turned on him with a unified fury, branding him a beast and a butcher. The political establishment, which had been content to look the other way as long as the violence remained contained within the underworld, was now under immense pressure to act. The massacre was an international scandal, making Chicago a global synonym for lawlessness and barbarism. Mayor William Hale Thompson, a political ally of Capone's, who had benefited greatly from his financial support, was forced to publicly denounce the violence and call for a crackdown, though his efforts were largely seen as theatrical and ineffectual. The real consequence, the one that would ultimately prove fatal to Capone, was the renewed and intensified resolve of the federal government. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated and eager to demonstrate his administration's commitment to law and order, was reportedly furious. He summoned his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, to the White House and delivered a simple, direct order: get Capone. The message was clear. The full weight of the United States government was now going to be brought to bear on one man. The strategy, however, remained the same. The Justice Department and the Prohibition Bureau were considered too corrupt or too clumsy to handle the job. The task remained firmly with Elmer Eyre and his small, elite team of T-men from the Treasury Special Intelligence Unit. The massacre had given them something they desperately needed: unwavering top-level support and a sense of urgency that transcended bureaucratic hurdles. They were now authorized to pursue Capone with every resource at their disposal, and their focus was laser sharp. They would not be distracted by the murders, for which they knew a conviction was nearly impossible. Their path was the seemingly mundane, paper trail crime of tax evasion. The challenge was monumental. Capone was famously careful with money. He never had a bank account in his own name. He never signed checks. He owned nothing directly. His homes, his cars, his businesses were all held in the names of front men, family members, or shell corporations. He operated on a cash-only basis, paying for his immense lifestyle with stacks of bills pulled from a suitcase. To build a case, Eyre's agents would have to become forensic archaeologists of Capone's life, piecing together a picture of his income, not from his own records, for there were none, but from the circumstantial evidence of his spending and the financial records of his empire's many tentacles. The man tasked with the ground investigation in Chicago was a brilliant and relentless Treasury agent named Frank J. Wilson, a former Secret Service agent who had hunted counterfeiters. Wilson was a bulldog with an accountant's mind, possessing a near superhuman tolerance for tedium. He began the painstaking work of constructing a net around Capone, one financial thread at a time. He and his team conducted interviews with hundreds of people, from bank tellers and real estate agents to tailors and hotel clerks. Anyone who had ever received a large cash payment from Capone or his associates. They subpoenaed the ledgers of the hotels where he stayed the casinos he owned, the brothels he controlled. They tracked the money flows from his speakeasies and breweries, following the cash from the street, level sale of a bottle of beer, all the way up the chain of command. It was a monumental task, like trying to empty Lake Michigan with a teacup, but Wilson was undeterred. The break they needed came from an unexpected source, the dogged efforts of a special prosecutor named George E. Chew Johnson, who was leading a parallel investigation into Capone's violation of Prohibition laws. Johnson's team had managed to flip one of Capone's key bookkeepers, a man named Leslie Shumway, who had kept the records for some of the outfit's most lucrative gambling houses, including the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero. Shumway provided detailed records of the immense profits from these operations, profits that flowed directly to Capone. But an even more significant breakthrough was on the horizon. Frank Wilson, spending countless hours in a dusty room filled with seized financial documents from a Capone-owned brothel, found a small, seemingly innocuous ledger. It appeared to be a record of the payoffs made to the Chicago Police Department. As Wilson meticulously cross-referenced the entries, his heart began to race. He noticed that one set of figures didn't align with the police payoffs. They were much larger and were designated with the letter A. He theorized that this was the record of the net profits from the brothel, and that the A stood for Al Capone's personal share. This ledger, if it could be authenticated, was a direct financial link to the man himself. But they needed more. The final and most critical piece of the puzzle fell into place when Wilson's investigation led him to a man named Fred Rise, a cashier at one of Capone's gambling dens. Rise was terrified, knowing that cooperating with the government was a death sentence. He was smuggled out of Chicago and hidden by federal agents who protected him from Capone's enforcers. When Rise finally agreed to testify, he could provide first-hand knowledge of Capone's ownership and his daily collection of the enormous cash profits from the casinos. With Shumway's ledgers, the cryptic A, entries in the payoff book, and Rise's eyewitness testimony, Frank Wilson and Elmer Irie finally had what they needed. They had built a case, not on the testimony of rival gangsters, but on the cold, hard, unimpeachable evidence of numbers. In June 1931, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Alphonse Capone for multiple counts of income tax evasion for the years 1924 through 1929. The charge was that he had failed to pay taxes on over $1 million of income. The King of Chicago, the man who had orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and had ruled an empire with absolute power, was finally going to be brought to trial, not for murder, but for failing to file a piece of paper with the government. The stage was set for one of the most celebrated criminal trials in American history. The indictment on tax evasion charges was a severe blow, but Al Capone was not a man who would go quietly into the night. He had spent a decade buying judges, intimidating witnesses, and manipulating the legal system. He saw the courtroom not as a hall of justice, but as another territory to be conquered through a combination of guile, influence, and threat. His first move was to assemble a formidable legal team. a group of the sharpest and most cunning defense attorneys money could buy, led by the brilliant and flamboyant Michael Ahern. Their strategy was multi-pronged and began even before the trial was scheduled. The first and most audacious line of defense was to negotiate a plea bargain. In a stunning move that demonstrated just how confident Capone was in his ability to manipulate the system, his lawyers managed to strike a deal with the federal prosecutor, George E.Q. Johnson. The agreement was that Capone would plead guilty to the tax evasion charges and the Prohibition violations in exchange for a recommended prison sentence of 2.5 years. For Capone, this was a calculated risk. He believed that even in a federal prison, he could serve a short sentence comfortably, maintaining control of his empire from behind bars, and be released while still a relatively young man to enjoy his immense wealth. The public, however, was outraged. The notion that the man responsible for hundreds of murders, for turning a major American city into a war zone, would receive a mere slap on the wrist for a technicality like tax evasion was seen as a gross miscarriage of justice. The newspapers railed against the deal, and public pressure mounted to an unbearable degree. This pressure found its focus in the judge who was assigned to the case, the Honorable James H. Wilkerson. Judge Wilkerson was a stern, no-nonsense jurist from downstate Illinois, a man with a reputation for integrity that was as unshakable as granite. He was not part of the Chicago machine and was utterly immune to the kind of political influence and backroom deals that Capone relied upon. When Capone stood before him in a federal courtroom on June 16, 1931, and formally entered his guilty plea, expecting a rubber stamp approval of the pre-arranged sentence, Judge Wilkerson dropped a bombshell. He looked down from the bench and coldly stated that he was not bound by any plea agreement between the prosecution and the defense. He refused to accept the plea. He told a stunned Capone and his lawyers that he might impose a much longer sentence than the one they had negotiated, and that if they wished to plead guilty, they would have to do so with no promises from the court. It was an unprecedented and devastating judicial rebuke. Faced with the prospect of an unknown and potentially devastating sentence, Capone's team had no choice. They withdrew the guilty plea. The deal was off. The case would now proceed to a full jury trial, a public spectacle where the full force of the government's evidence would be laid bare for the world to see. Judge Wilkerson's decision was the first major crack in Capone's armor, a clear signal that his old methods of coercion and deal-making would not work in this courtroom. The trial of the United States of America v. Al Capone began on October 6, 1931, and it was, from its very first moments, a media circus of unparalleled proportions. The courtroom was packed with reporters from across the globe, their telegraph keys clicking incessantly, sending updates on every development to a captivated world. Capone arrived each day dressed in immaculate, brightly colored suits, a dazzling diamond pinky ring on his finger, projecting an image of unshakable confidence. He smiled for the cameras, joked with his lawyers, and behaved as if he were a celebrity attending a premiere. not a defendant on trial for his freedom, but beneath the bravado. The strategy of his defense team was becoming clear. They could not refute the financial evidence directly. The ledgers and records were too damning. Instead, they pursued a strategy of obstruction, confusion, and intimidation. They filed a barrage of motions, challenging the validity of the evidence, the jurisdiction of the court, and the legality of the tax laws themselves. They argued that since Capone's income was derived from illegal activities, it was not taxable income at all, a legal theory that was creative but ultimately flimsy. Their most crucial and most insidious tactic was directed at the jury. It was an open secret in Chicago that juries could be bought, bribed, or threatened. Capone's men began a campaign to infiltrate and corrupt the jury pool. They gathered the names and addresses of the prospective jurors and set about discovering their weaknesses, their debts, their secrets. Agents of the outfit approached several jurors with offers of generous bribes in exchange for a vote for acquittal. It was a classic Capone maneuver, an attempt to subvert the very heart of the justice system. But Frank Wilson and the federal agents were prepared for this. They had been monitoring the jury list closely, and when they received a tip that a juror named James T. Milroy had been approached with a bribe, they immediately alerted Judge Wilkerson. The judge's response was swift, decisive, and brilliant, without warning the defense. He took the extraordinary step of switching the entire jury panel with another one that was sitting in a different courtroom for a civil case. The switch happened in an instant, leaving Capone's lawyers flabbergasted and powerless. The new jury was composed of men who had not been vetted or approached by the defense, men who were, as far as the court could tell, impartial. It was a masterstroke that completely neutralized Capone's most potent weapon. With the jury now secure, the prosecution began to methodically present its case. George Johnson and his team laid out the mountain of evidence they had so painstakingly collected. The ledgers from the gambling houses showing massive profits, the testimony of Leslie Shumway, who detailed the inner financial workings of the empire, and the crucial testimony of Fred Rise, who, under heavy guard, took the stand and pointed a finger directly at Al Capone, identifying him as the owner and daily recipient of the cash from the Hawthorne Smoke shop. The evidence was dry, financial, and utterly compelling. It painted a picture not of a glamorous gangster, but of a successful, wealthy businessman who had willfully chosen not to pay his taxes. The defense's case, in contrast, seemed weak and desperate. They called a parade of witnesses who offered vague and contradictory testimony, attempting to suggest that Capone had lost large sums of money gambling, or that his lavish spending was merely the generosity of a big-hearted man, not evidence of income. It was unconvincing. The numbers, as Frank Wilson had always believed, did not lie. As the trial drew to a close, the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. The king's castle, built on a foundation of cash and corruption, was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the relentless and mundane force of arithmetic. The final act of the trial unfolded with a tension that gripped the entire nation. a dramatic climax to a years-long struggle between lawlessness and the rule of law. The prosecution, having meticulously laid out its case, rested with the quiet confidence of men who knew they had built an unassailable fortress of facts and figures. The defense, in its final arguments, resorted to a combination of theatrical oratory and legal technicalities, attempting to paint their client as a victim of government overreach and a man whose finances were too chaotic to be accurately assessed. They appealed to the jury's potential sympathy, asking if a man could really be sent to prison for a simple oversight, for failing to understand the complex tax codes. But the sheer weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The image of Capone's lavish lifestyle, paid for with countless untraceable cash payments, stood in stark contrast to the claim of a man with no taxable income. The jury, the 12 men who had been so unexpectedly and fortuitously switched, listened intently, their faces giving away little. They had heard the dry recitation of numbers from ledgers, the nervous but firm testimony of bookkeepers who had broken the code of silence, and they had seen the defendant sitting at his table, his initial bravado slowly giving way to a grim, simmering anxiety. He could feel the walls closing in, not with the dramatic flair of a police raid, but with the inexorable, bureaucratic precision of a balance sheet. The final word belonged to the prosecution and George E. Q. Johnson rose to deliver his closing argument. He did not need to be flamboyant. The facts were his drama. He methodically, almost gently, walked the jury back through the evidence, connecting the dots between the cash collected from the gambling dens and the opulent life of the defendant. He presented Capone not as a legendary gangster, but as a tax cheat, a man who believed himself above the most fundamental duty of a citizen. He appealed not to their emotions, but to their sense of civic responsibility, arguing that to acquit Capone would be to declare that the law did not apply to those with enough wealth and power to flout it. Judge Wilkerson's instructions to the jury were a masterpiece of clarity and force, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He systematically dismantled the defense's key arguments, instructing the jury that income from illegal activities was indeed taxable, a point of law that was crucial. He emphasized that the government did not need to prove the exact amount of unpaid taxes, only that a substantial income had been earned and willfully not reported. His words were a legal guide, but they were also a powerful endorsement of the prosecution's entire approach. The jury retired to deliberate on October 17, 1931. The world waited. Capone and his lawyers retreated to a private room, their confidence shattered, now clinging to the slim hope of a hung jury. But the jury, insulated from the corruption that had defined Chicago for so long, was not swayed. They had seen the evidence for what it was: clear, convincing, and damning. After less than 9 hours of deliberation, they filed back into the packed, silent courtroom. The verdict was ready. The clerk read the charges, and for each count of tax evasion, the foreman uttered the same single word: guilty. A collective gasp, then a murmur, rippled through the room. Al Capone, the man who had ruled an empire, the name that had inspired terror and fascination across the globe, showed little emotion. He simply slumped back in his chair, his face a stony mask. The invincible fortress had fallen, not to bullets, but to paperwork. The judge set the sentencing for a later date, but the message was clear. The reign of the Godfather of Chicago was over. The sentencing hearing was a brief, formal affair, a stark contrast to the drama of the trial. On November 24, 1931, Al Capone stood once more before Judge James H. Wilkerson, this time not as a defendant hoping for acquittal, but as a convicted felon awaiting his fate. The prosecution asked for the maximum penalty, arguing that Capone's massive and flagrant disregard for the law, coupled with his role as the kingpin of a vast criminal enterprise, demanded a sentence that would serve as a powerful deterrent. The defense, in a final, desperate plea, appealed for leniency, citing Capone's charity work and his family responsibilities, but Judge Wilkerson was unmoved. He saw through the facade of the public benefactor to the ruthless criminal beneath. He addressed Capone directly, his voice cold and stern, condemning the system of which Capone was the head, a system built on bribery and violence that had corrupted the youth and mocked the institutions of the nation. He then pronounced the sentence, 11 years in a federal penitentiary, a $50,000 fine, and court costs of another $30,000. It was the most severe sentence ever handed down for tax evasion up to that time. The number, 11 years, echoed through the courtroom. For Capone, it was a life sentence in everything but name. He was 32 years old. He would be 43 when he was released, his empire dismantled, his power evaporated, his health likely broken. The man who had controlled everything was now a number, a prisoner of the state. He was first sent to the Cook County Jail to await transfer, and from there, in May 1932, he began his journey into the federal prison system. His initial placement was at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, a grim, massive fortress known for its harsh discipline. Capone arrived expecting special treatment, believing his wealth and notoriety would grant him privileges even behind bars. For a short while, he managed to bribe guards to secure small comforts, but federal authorities, determined to break him completely, soon caught on. They decided he needed to be in a place where his name and his money held no sway whatsoever, a place designed to break the spirit of the most recalcitrant criminals. In August 1934, he was transferred to the most feared prison in America, a stark, damp island fortress in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz. The Rock was his new home, and it was here that the final, tragic act of Al Capone's life would truly begin, an act not of power and glory, but of physical and mental decay, a slow and painful unraveling that would see the once mighty king reduced to a ghost of his former self, a cautionary tale etched not in headlines, but in the silent, crushing solitude of a concrete cell. The transfer to Alcatraz marked the definitive end of Al Capone's world. The island, known universally as the Rock, was more than a prison. It was a symbol of absolute isolation and incorruptible authority, a place deliberately designed to strip men of their identity and their hope. When Capone arrived on the fog, Shrouded Island in August of 1934, he was no longer public enemy number one. He was federal prisoner number 85, a cog in a machine of relentless discipline and routine. The warden, James A. Johnston, was a man of unimpeachable integrity, a strict disciplinarian who ran Alcatraz with a set of unbendable rules. There were no special privileges, no opportunities for bribery, no contact with the outside world beyond heavily censored letters and rare, monitored visits. The guards, carefully selected for their professionalism and resistance to corruption, were instructed to show no favoritism. For Capone, this was a new and terrifying form of powerlessness. His entire adult life had been built on his ability to manipulate people and systems with money and fear. On Alcatraz, neither currency held any value. The prison's brutal daily schedule was a great leveler. Wake at 6:30 a.m., work in the prison industries like the mat shop or the laundry, meals eaten in silence. Lights out at 9:30 p.m. The cell he occupied, 5 by 9 feet, was Spartan, containing only a cot, a sink, and a toilet. The view from the small, barred window was not of the vibrant city of Chicago he had once ruled, but of the cold, gray waters of the San Francisco Bay, a constant, chilling reminder of his isolation. Capone, who had always been the center of attention, was now just another inmate, and many of the other prisoners, hardened bank robbers and kidnappers who despised gangsters, saw him as a target, a way to build their own reputations. He was forced to fight for his dignity, and while he held his own in several altercations, the constant threat of violence and the oppressive monotony of prison life began to erode his formidable spirit. The man who had once commanded an army of gunmen now had to follow orders, his every movement watched and controlled. It was in this environment of supreme powerlessness that the first subtle signs of his physical decline began to manifest. He complained of persistent health problems, but the prison doctors, wary of malingering, often dismissed his ailments. Unbeknownst to them and to Capone himself, a far more insidious enemy than any rival gangster or federal agent had already taken root within him years before, an enemy that the stress and despair of prison life were now accelerating. This was the late stage effects of syphilis, a disease he had contracted in his youth during his days running brothels, a disease that had gone largely untreated and was now beginning its slow, destructive march through his central nervous system. The first undeniable public crack in Capone's mental facade appeared in the prison laundry. While working his assigned job, another inmate, a Texan bank robber named James Lucas, refused his order to move a cart. For Capone, whose word had once been law, this was an intolerable insult. He flew into a rage and attacked Lucas with a pair of heavy prison issue scissors. The attack was not the calculated violence of a gangland execution. It was the wild, uncontrolled fury of a man whose mind was beginning to fracture under the strain. The guards quickly subdued him, and he was placed in solitary confinement. The dreaded strip cells of Alcatraz, where inmates were kept in complete darkness and silence. This incident was a turning point. It demonstrated to the prison authorities and to the other inmates that the legendary Al Capone was losing his grip. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He was found wandering the prison corridors, disoriented and confused. He began to babble incoherently, at times believing he was still the boss of Chicago, at other times descending into childlike terror. He would have violent mood swings and suffered from debilitating headaches and bouts of paralysis. The prison doctors initially diagnosed him with psychosis, but as his symptoms worsened, the true cause became apparent: general paresis, the final catastrophic stage of syphilis, which causes severe brain damage, dementia, and eventually death. The disease was ravaging his mind, erasing his memories and destroying his cognitive functions. The once sharp strategic thinker was becoming a helpless invalid. He was transferred to the prison hospital wing, where he spent his days in a confused haze, often playing his banjo for hours on end, lost in a world of his own making. The federal government, having achieved its goal of breaking him, now had a new problem: what to do with a dying man who was no longer a threat to anyone. His lawyers and family began a long campaign for his release on humanitarian grounds, arguing that he was no longer competent and required specialized medical care that the prison could not provide. The process was slow, mired in bureaucracy and a lingering public desire to see him serve his full sentence. Finally, after years of appeals, and with Capone's condition deteriorating to the point where he was largely incoherent and required constant care, the government relented. On January 6, 1939, after serving 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days of his 11-year sentence, a broken and mentally enfeebled Al Capone was released from Alcatraz. He was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Terminal Island, California, to complete the final year of his sentence, but his physical state was so dire that he was released from there on November 16, 1939, officially a free man. But his freedom was an illusion. The man who walked out of prison was a ghost, a hollow shell. He was 40 years old, but he had the mind of a child and the ravaged body of an old man. The king had not been dethroned. He had been utterly annihilated, not by a bullet, but by a microscopic spirochete and the unyielding justice of a system he had once believed he was above. His return to his Palm Island estate in Miami was not a triumphant homecoming, but a quiet retreat into seclusion, the final chapter in a life of spectacular rise and catastrophic fall. The final 8 years of Al Capone's life were a protracted and undignified epilogue, a stark and sorrowful contrast to the roaring, violent symphony of his prime. His return to his Palm Island estate in Miami was not a celebration, but a confinement of a different sort. The sprawling, luxurious property, once a symbol of his untouchable wealth and a hub of scheming and partying, was now a gilded cage, a sanatorium for a dying man. The formidable figure who had commanded fear and respect was gone, replaced by a frail, confused invalid who required constant supervision. His mind, ravaged by the advanced stages of paresis, existed in a foggy limbo. There were fleeting moments of lucidity where he might recognize his wife, May, or his son, Sonny, but these were islands in a sea of confusion. He would often drift into the past, muttering about long, forgotten business deals, or imagining conversations with Johnny Torrio or other ghosts from his Chicago days. At other times, he would be gripped by paranoia, convinced that his old enemies were coming for him, or he would lapse into a childlike state, needing to be fed, dressed, and cared for like an infant. The physical symptoms of his disease were equally devastating. He suffered from debilitating headaches, tremors in his hands that made it impossible for him to hold his beloved banjo, and occasional bouts of paralysis. His body, once stout and powerful, grew weak and emaciated. The famous scars on his face seemed to stand out even more starkly against his pale, gaunt features. May Capone. The woman who had stood by him through the heights of his infamy and the depths of his trial now became his full-time nurse, her life dedicated to his care with a stoic and unwavering devotion. The outside world, which had once been obsessed with his every move, largely forgot about him. The press, which had feasted on his exploits for over a decade, now found the story of his decay too sad and undramatic to cover. The era of Prohibition was a distant memory, and the Great Depression had been replaced by the global cataclysm of the Second World War. America had new heroes and new villains. The name Al Capone was fading into history, becoming a cautionary tale told to children, a symbol of a bygone age of lawlessness. His isolation was nearly total. Few visitors came to Palm Island, and those who did were often shocked by the sight of the broken man, shuffling through the halls of his mansion, a living ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The empire he had built had long since crumbled. The outfit, ever pragmatic, had reorganized under new, less flamboyant leadership. Learning the crucial lesson from Capone's downfall, the importance of staying out of the headlines. His wealth, much of which had been seized by the government to pay his tax debts and fines, had dwindled, and the immense costs of his medical care further eroded what remained. The king of a multimillion-dollar empire was, in his final years, a significant financial burden on his family. As the 1940s progressed, Capone's health continued its irreversible decline. In 1946, his condition worsened significantly. He suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and even more mentally disconnected from the world around him. Doctors confirmed what had been apparent. For years, the end was near. The syphilitic infection had caused irreversible and widespread damage to his brain and other vital organs. There was no hope of recovery, only the grim wait for the inevitable. On January 21, 1947, his family gathered around him at the Palm Island estate. He had developed bronchial pneumonia, a common and often fatal complication for bedridden patients in his condition. His body, already weakened by years of neurological decay, had no strength left to fight. 3 days later, on the afternoon of January 25, 1947, with his wife and son at his bedside, Al Capone took his final, labored breath. He was 48 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the true cause was the cumulative destruction wrought by tertiary syphilis, a disease that had acted as a silent, patient assassin, completing the work that the bullets of his rivals and the courts of his country had started. The news of his death made the front pages of newspapers across the country. But the tone was not one of celebration or mourning, but of sober reflection. He was not eulogized as a great man or even a particularly successful gangster in the end. He was remembered as a tragic figure, a symbol of the violent excesses of the Prohibition era and the ultimate futility of a life built on crime. His body was transported back to Chicago, the city he had both terrorized and defined, for burial. The funeral was a quiet, private affair, a stark contrast to the garish spectacle of his life. Only family and a few close associates attended the services at the chapel and then at the Mount Olivet Cemetery. There were no lengthy processions of sleek black cars, no crowds of curious onlookers, no grandiose speeches. He was laid to rest in a simple grave. The inscription on the headstone, bearing only his name and the dates of his birth and death. There was no mention of his infamy, his power, or his nickname. It was an ordinary end for a man who had lived anything but an ordinary life. In death, as in his final years, he achieved the anonymity he had so assiduously avoided in life. The Godfather of Chicago was gone, and with him closed one of the most violent and dramatic chapters in American history. His legacy, however, was far more complex than the simple story of a gangster's rise and fall. He became a permanent part of the American cultural landscape, an archetype of the self made criminal, a warning about the corrupting nature of power and an enduring subject of fascination. His story retold in countless books, films, and television shows, ensuring that the name Al Capone would never truly be forgotten. Even as the man himself faded into the mists of time and myth, the death of Al Capone did not simply close a book. It left a complex and sprawling legacy that extended far beyond the grave, influencing the structure of organized crime, the tactics of law enforcement, and the very psyche of the American nation for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the city of Chicago, which had been the stage for his brutal drama, began a slow and arduous process of change. The sheer notoriety of Capone's reign had created a public and political demand for reform that could no longer be ignored. While corruption was far from eradicated, the era of the flamboyant, publicly recognized gangster king was effectively over. The outfit, the criminal organization he had helped build to its terrifying zenith, did not disintegrate with his imprisonment or death. Instead, it underwent a profound transformation, learning the critical lessons that Capone's downfall had so starkly illustrated. The new leadership, first under Frank Nitti, and then later under figures like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, were men of a different breed. They were low profile, pragmatic, and deeply cautious. They understood that Capone's greatest mistake had been his visibility, his public persona, his constant engagement with the press, and his blatant flaunting of wealth had made him a target. The new bosses operated from the shadows, avoiding the spotlight, conducting their business with a quiet, corporate efficiency. They diversified their interests, moving deeper into labor racketeering, jukebox and vending machine monopolies, and eventually Las Vegas casinos, all while maintaining their core enterprises of gambling and loan sharking. They enforced discipline, not through spectacular massacres that drew national headlines, but through quiet, targeted assassinations that rarely made the front page. This new, more insidious model of organized crime was, in many ways, more difficult to combat because it was less visible and more deeply embedded in the legitimate economy. Capone's legacy to the underworld, therefore, was not his empire, which was fleeting, but the blueprint of what not to do, a masterclass in the perils of excessive ambition and public exposure. His successors built their lasting power on the foundation of his failures, creating a criminal corporation that would endure for generations, its influence seeping into the fabric of American life in ways that were less dramatic, but perhaps more pervasive than the beer wars of the 1920s. On the other side of the law, the successful prosecution of Al Capone represented a watershed moment for federal law enforcement. The victory of Elmer Eyre, Frank Wilson, and the Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit proved that even the most powerful and seemingly untouchable criminal could be brought to justice through tenacity, intelligence, and a focus on financial crimes. The Al Capone model of prosecution, targeting a criminal for tax evasion when other charges are too difficult to prove, became a standard weapon in the federal arsenal. It was a strategy used time and again against mobsters, corrupt politicians, and later, even against modern-day celebrities and business magnates. The case established the principle that all income, regardless of its source, is taxable, a foundational concept that greatly expanded the power of the Internal Revenue Service. Furthermore, the investigation demonstrated the immense value of forensic accounting, of following the money trail, a technique that would become central to combating complex white-collar crime and organized criminal enterprises in the future. The fame and prestige that Eyre and Wilson garnered also helped to professionalize federal law enforcement, paving the way for the expansion and increased authority of agencies like the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. While Hoover had deliberately kept his bureau away from the Capone case, fearing failure, the public's thirst for federal heroes in the war on crime created an environment that allowed the FBI to grow into the powerful institution it would become. The Capone case thus fundamentally altered the relationship between the American government and its criminal element, establishing that the federal government had both the will and the means to pursue criminals across state lines and into the darkest corners of the underworld. It was a declaration that no one was above the law, a message that resonated deeply with a public that had grown weary of the chaos and violence of the Prohibition era. The story of his downfall became a foundational myth of American justice, a tale told and retold to illustrate that no matter how high a person rises, the long arm of the law, especially the tax man, will eventually find them. This narrative provided a sense of order and moral closure, reassuring the nation that its institutions, though sometimes slow to act, were ultimately resilient and just. It was a powerful and enduring myth, one that would shape public perception and law enforcement strategy for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. a direct and lasting consequence of the battle to dethrone the King of Chicago. Beyond the immediate shifts in the underworld and law enforcement, the figure of Al Capone began a remarkable metamorphosis in the years following his death, transforming from a feared criminal into an enduring and multifaceted icon within American popular culture. His life, with its Shakespearean arc of meteoric rise and catastrophic fall, proved to be a source of endless fascination for writers, filmmakers, and the public alike. The initial wave of cultural representation began even before his death, with the gritty gangster films of the early 1930s, such as Scarface in 1932, heavily inspired by his story. These films, while often moralistic on the surface, tapped into a public disillusioned by the Great Depression and in the rebellious, self-made gangster. They found an anti-hero who challenged a system that seemed to have failed the common man. Capone himself was reportedly a fan of the 1932 Scarface, seeing it as a testament to his power, a chilling indication of his own lack of self-awareness. After his death, the mythologizing process accelerated. He became a symbol of the roaring 20s itself, a personification of the era's jazz, age energy, its moral ambiguity, its rampant consumerism, and its violent underbelly. Countless biographies were written, each attempting to unravel the enigma of the man, to separate the fact from the legend that had grown around him. He was portrayed in television series and major motion pictures, often by Hollywood's most charismatic actors, a process that inevitably sanded down the rough, brutal edges of the real man and replaced them with a more palatable, dramatic allure. This cultural repackaging did something remarkable. It allowed the public to engage with the terror and excitement of his era from a safe distance, to experience the thrill of his power without suffering its consequences. The very items associated with him, the vintage Tommy gun, the classic fedora, the long black limousine, became instantly recognizable symbols of a bygone age of outlaw glamour. This cultural absorption speaks to a complex national psychology. Capone represented the dark side of the American dream, the terrifying possibility that the drive for success, when utterly unmoored from morality and the rule of law, could lead not to prosperity and happiness, but to a gilded cage of paranoia, violence, and self-destruction. He was the ultimate self, made man gone horribly wrong. A cautionary tale that was as much about the flaws in the national character as it was about the failings of one individual. This cultural legacy is inextricably linked to the historical mysteries that continue to swirl around his life. Unsolved questions that have fueled speculation and debate for decades, and further cemented his status as a figure of endless intrigue. The most prominent of these is the question of who actually pulled the triggers in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While it is universally accepted that the order came from Capone, the identities of the executioners have never been definitively proven. The most popular theory, supported by some law enforcement officials of the time, points to a crew led by Fred "Killer" Burke, a prolific hitman associated with the Egan's Rats gang from St. Louis, who was known to have done work for Capone. This theory suggests that the use of out of town gunmen was a deliberate tactic to ensure there were no recognizable faces that could be tied back to the outfit. Other theories implicate members of Capone's own inner circle, but a lack of concrete evidence and the wall of silence that protected Capone during his life has kept the full truth shrouded in mystery. Another lingering question involves the fate of his immense fortune. At his peak, his empire was pulling in an estimated $100 million a year, a sum that would equate to billions today. Yet, by the time of his death, much of that wealth had seemingly vanished. The government seized what it could find to satisfy his tax debts, but it was a fraction of the total. It is believed that large sums were hidden in secret accounts, invested in legitimate businesses through front men, or converted into cash and jewelry held by trusted family members and associates. The idea of lost Capone treasure continues to captivate treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists, though it is more likely that the fortune was simply dissipated by the costs of his legal defense, his fines, his prolonged medical care, and the quiet redistribution of assets among his former lieutenants who took control of his criminal enterprises. These unresolved mysteries act as open threads in the tapestry of his story, inviting endless re-examination and ensuring that his narrative is never fully complete. They are the shadows that his legend casts, areas where history gives way to speculation and where the figure of Capone continues to live and breathe in the imagination of the public, a ghost that has never been fully laid to rest. This enduring mystery, combined with his dramatic life story, ensures that Al Capone remains more than just a historical figure. He is a permanent archetype, a symbol whose meaning shifts with the times, but whose presence in the American consciousness is guaranteed for generations to come. A dark star in the constellation of the nation's history, whose light, though extinguished long ago, continues to reach us across the decades. To truly understand the phenomenon of Al Capone, one must look beyond the man himself and examine the intricate web of relationships that both enabled his rise and were ultimately shaped by his colossal presence. A network of family, allies, and victims whose lives were irrevocably altered by their proximity to his power. At the center of this personal universe was his family, the one sphere where he demanded and often displayed a fierce, traditional loyalty. His wife, May Coughlin Capone, was a figure of quiet dignity and immense fortitude, a woman who remained steadfastly by his side from their hurried marriage in 1918, following the birth of their son Albert Francis, Sonny, Capone. Through the dizzying heights of his fame to the humiliating depths of his imprisonment and his final, pathetic decline, their relationship remains one of the more complex and private aspects of his life. She was his anchor, providing a semblance of normalcy and domesticity in a world otherwise drenched in violence and chaos. She never spoke publicly about his crimes, shielding herself and their son from the relentless glare of the media, a testament to a loyalty that transcended his notoriety. Their son, Sonny, bore a heavy burden, growing up in the shadow of the most infamous name in America. He was a sickly child, diagnosed with congenital syphilis, a cruel inheritance from his father, which required multiple surgeries and left him with impaired hearing. He was sent to boarding schools under an assumed name in a desperate attempt to provide him with a normal life. But the truth of his identity was an inescapable specter. Despite this, Sonny managed to carve out a life for himself, changing his name and living in quiet obscurity, a deliberate and understandable rejection of the terrifying legacy his father had bequeathed him. Beyond his immediate family were his brothers, who were deeply enmeshed in his empire. His older brother, James, who oddly enough worked as a Prohibition agent in Nebraska, and his younger brother, John, were less involved, but his other brother, Ralph Bottles Capone, was a key lieutenant, overseeing the vital bottling operations for their bootlegging business, and later serving time for tax evasion himself. A clear example of how the Capone name became a brand synonymous with legal peril. The family dynamic was a classic immigrant story in one sense. A tight, knit clan bound by blood and shared experience, but it was tragically distorted by the immense criminal enterprise that Al built, turning their name into a curse and their lives into a public spectacle from which they could never fully escape. Beyond the blood relatives was his criminal family, a roster of formidable and often deadly individuals who formed the administrative and military backbone of the outfit. These were the men who translated Capone's ambitions into reality, and their fates were inextricably linked to his. There was Frank Nitti, known as the Enforcer, a quiet, ruthless man who was Capone's primary lieutenant, and the one who would officially take over the syndicate after Capone's imprisonment. Though his reign was shorter and plagued by its own troubles, culminating in his suicide in 1943 following pressure from the government, there was Jack Machine Gun McGurn, a flashy, hot-tempered hitman and former boxer who was widely suspected of being one of the chief planners of the sting. Valentine's Day Massacre, a crime for which he was never convicted, and who himself would die in a gangland shooting in 1936, a classic end for a man who lived by the gun. There was Tony Accardo, a young, rising enforcer known for his intelligence and cool head, who would later become one of the most powerful and enduring bosses of the Chicago outfit, ruling for decades and perfectly embodying the low-profile ethos that Capone never learned. And then there were the financial and political architects, men like Jake Grazy Thumb Guzik, who handled the complex bribery network that kept the police and politicians on the payroll, and Murray the Camel Humphreys, a sophisticated strategist who specialized in corrupting labor unions. This organization was a dark mirror of a legitimate corporation with its own CEOs, CFOs, and directors of operations, all coordinated by the charismatic and terrifying figure of Capone at its head. But for every loyal lieutenant, there were countless victims, names often lost to history, who formed the human cost of his empire. They were the rival gangsters gunned down in the streets, the businessmen who refused to pay for protection and saw their establishments bombed, the innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of the beer wars, and the 7 men lined up and executed against a garage wall on a cold February morning. The story of Al Capone is not just the story of one man's ambition. It is the story of a vast and intricate ecosystem that he dominated, a system composed of countless lives that were elevated, enriched, ruined, or ended by their connection to him. His rise created kings, and his fall left power vacuums, but at the most human level. It left behind a trail of broken families, traumatized survivors, and a city that for a time lived in the grip of a fear that was as much a part of his legacy as his notoriety. A silent, pervasive terror that is often forgotten in the glamorized retellings of his life, but which was the most real and lasting consequence of his rule for the ordinary people of Chicago. The physical landscape of Capone's empire, the very streets and buildings that served as the stage for his drama, also hold a legacy, a silent testament to a vanished world that continues to whisper his name to those who know where to listen. Chicago itself is a city layered with history, and the Prohibition era forms one of its most compelling and darkly romantic strata. While much has been demolished and rebuilt, traces of Capone's Chicago still remain, if one knows how to look for them. The most famous of these is the former site of the Lexington Hotel at 22nd and Michigan, his fortified headquarters known as the Fortress, though the hotel itself was demolished in 1995. The empty lot and the memory of the building stand as a powerful symbol of his reign, a place from which he commanded his empire and from which he narrowly escaped death during Himi Weiss's military-style assault. In the suburb of Cicero, the Hawthorne Hotel, which housed the Hawthorne Smoke Shop, one of his most lucrative gambling operations, still stands. A brick and mortar relic of the town he once completely controlled through intimidation and ballot stuffing. Then there is the most infamous address of all, 2122 North Clark Street, the location of the SMC Cartage Company garage, the scene of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The garage was torn down in 1967, and the land is now a quiet, unassuming lawn next to a nursing home, a stark and peaceful contrast to the horrific violence that once stained that ground. For years, the bricks from the north wall of the garage, pockmarked with bullet holes, were salvaged and sold as morbid souvenirs, a grisly traffic in relics that speaks to the enduring, macabre fascination with the event. Beyond these specific locations, the entire south side of Chicago was once dotted with his speakeasies, breweries, and distilleries, many of them hidden in plain sight, their operations protected by a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the city's government. These physical remnants are more than just historical curiosities. They are tangible connections to the past, places that force us to reconcile the bustling, modern city of today with its violent, chaotic past. They serve as a reminder that history is not an abstract concept confined to books, but something that happened in real places, on streets we can walk, leaving echoes that never fully fade away. This tangible history is meticulously preserved and presented at a very different kind of landmark. The Green Mill Cocktail Lounge in Chicago's uptown neighborhood. This iconic jazz club was once a favorite haunt of Capone's. He reportedly had a favorite booth with a clear view of both the front and back doors. A prudent precaution for a man with so many enemies. It is said that tunnels ran beneath the club, used for a quick escape or for moving alcohol during raids. Today, the Green Mill actively embraces its notorious heritage, marketing itself as a living museum of the Capone era, where patrons can sip a cocktail and imagine the gangster himself holding court in a cloud of cigar smoke, the sounds of a jazz trumpet filling the air. This transformation of a place of genuine danger into a venue of nostalgic entertainment is a microcosm of how Capone's legacy has been processed and packaged for public consumption. The danger is gone, replaced by a safe, curated thrill. Similarly, his former home in Palm Island, Miami, remains a private residence, a beautiful, secluded property that belies the tragic scenes of mental and physical decay that unfolded within its walls during the final years of his life. These locations, from the demolished sites of violence to the preserved haunts of leisure, form a pilgrimage trail for those fascinated by this era. They represent the two sides of the Capone coin: the brutal, ruthless gangster who terrorized a city, and the charismatic, glamorous figure who has been immortalized in popular culture. Walking this trail, from the quiet lawn on Clark Street to the vibrant energy of the Green Mill, one is confronted with the full complexity of his story, the undeniable evil of his actions, and the strange, enduring allure of his myth. It is a journey through a landscape forever marked by his presence, a physical manifestation of a story that is at once uniquely American and universally understood, a tale of ambition, power, and the inevitable price that must be paid for both, a price that was exacted not only from Capone himself, but from the very city he called his own, a city whose streets and buildings still remember the shadow of the man who once ruled them all. To fully appreciate the scale of Al Capone's operation and the sheer audacity of his reign, it is essential to delve into the intricate mechanics of his bootlegging empire, a colossal, vertically integrated business that functioned with an efficiency that would be the envy of any legitimate corporation. The process began with the sourcing of the alcohol itself, while the outfit operated its own hidden breweries and distilleries in Chicago's industrial districts. Often disguised as legitimate businesses, a significant portion of their supply came from outside the city and even outside the country. A primary source was Canada, where Prohibition was not in effect. Massive shipments of high-quality Canadian whiskey were smuggled across the Great Lakes on fast boats, running without lights at night to evade the Coast Guard. These boats, often manned by experienced runners, would transfer their cargo to smaller vessels or directly to trucks at secluded coves and inlets along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Another major source was the rural Midwest, where countless small, illegal stills produced raw, potent moonshine. Capone's organization would either buy this product in bulk or simply muscle in and take over the operations, imposing a tax on the independent producers for the privilege of operating within his territory. Once the raw alcohol was secured, the next step was processing and distribution. The raw moonshine was often dangerous, contaminated with toxins like methanol, which could cause blindness or death. Capone's operation established sophisticated cutting and blending facilities, where the raw alcohol would be filtered, diluted, and mixed with water, caramel coloring, and other flavorings to mimic the taste of branded whiskeys, gins, and rums. It was then bottled, often using counterfeit labels of popular pre-Prohibition brands, and packaged for distribution. This was the heart of the industrial operation, and it required a complex logistics network. The finished product was transported in trucks that were specially modified with hidden compartments, false floors, and heavy-duty suspensions to carry the immense weight of the liquid cargo. These trucks moved under the cover of night, following routes that were constantly changed to avoid ambushes from rival gangs or interdiction by law enforcement. Crucially, many of these trucks were accompanied by police escorts, their services paid for by the regular envelopes of cash delivered by Jake, Greasy Thumb, Guzik to precinct captains and police headquarters. This corruption was the grease that kept the entire machine running smoothly. If a truck was stopped by an honest cop, the driver had a list of lawyers on retainer to post bail immediately, and the case would almost always be dismissed by a friendly judge later on. The final link in the chain was the speakeasy, the illicit social hub that became the defining institution of the Prohibition era. Capone's empire supplied hundreds of these establishments across Chicago and the suburbs, from plush, velvet, roped clubs frequented by the city's elite to dimly lit, sawdust, floored bars in working-class neighborhoods. The speakeasies were the retail outlets, the point of sale where the public's insatiable demand met Capone's ruthless supply. The relationship was symbiotic, but heavily weighted in Capone's favor. A speakeasy owner who tried to buy from a different supplier or who fell behind on payments would first receive a warning, which could involve a brick through a window or a beating for the owner. Continued defiance would result in the premises being bombed or the owner being murdered. This system of enforced monopoly allowed Capone to control prices and ensure a steady, massive cash flow. The money collected from the speakeasies and his own gambling houses was then funneled upward through the organization. It was collected by cashiers like Fred Rise, who would then deliver the daily takings to a central counting room. Here, teams of bookkeepers, under the supervision of men like Leslie Shumway, would tally the receipts, deduct operating expenses, which included everything from bribes to soldiers' salaries to the cost of brewing equipment, and then allocate the profits. A significant portion was set aside for the boodle, the massive fund used for payoffs to police, politicians, judges, and jury members. Another portion was reinvested into the business, buying new trucks, establishing new breweries, or funding the acquisition of more legitimate front businesses. The remainder, the pure profit, was then distributed to the top echelon of the outfit, with Capone as the majority shareholder, taking the lion's share. This cash, millions of dollars in untraceable bills, was what funded his opulent lifestyle, his extensive wardrobe, his diamond pinky rings, his armored limousines, and his Palm Island estate. It was a cash-based economy on an industrial scale, and it was this very success, this immense and visible wealth, that ultimately provided the thread which federal agents would so painstakingly pull, unraveling the entire tapestry of his empire. The bootlegging operation was a masterpiece of illicit entrepreneurship, a dark triumph of supply and demand. But it was built on a foundation of violence and corruption that was destined to collapse, proving that even the most perfectly engineered criminal enterprise is ultimately vulnerable to the relentless, mundane power of the balance sheet and the law. While the bootlegging operation was the financial engine of Capone's empire, it was the pervasive and systematic corruption that served as its protective shield, a second, invisible infrastructure without which the entire enterprise would have collapsed under the weight of its own illegality. This corruption was not a matter of a few bribes to beat cops. It was a sophisticated, deeply entrenched system that reached into the highest echelons of Chicago's government, its police department, and its judiciary, creating a parallel state where Capone's law was the only one that truly mattered. At the street level, this meant that every police officer on his payroll, from the lowliest patrolman to the precinct captain, played a crucial role. They provided escorts for liquor trucks, tipped off speakeasy owners about impending raids, which were often carefully staged performances for the press, targeting only insignificant, non-paying operations, and ensured that outfit-owned establishments could operate with impunity. When violence did occur, these officers would often arrive late, lose crucial evidence, or take statements from witnesses who suddenly found themselves unable to remember anything of consequence. This network was managed with corporate efficiency by Jake Grazy Thumb Gozik, a man who looked more like a humble accountant than a criminal mastermind, but whose ledgers contained the names and price tags of countless public officials. The flow of cash was constant and immense, delivered in regular, plain envelopes that functioned as a second, more reliable city payroll. But the corruption extended far beyond the police force. The political machine of Chicago, particularly the Republican organization of Mayor William Hale, Big Bill Thompson, was deeply enmeshed with Capone's interests. Thompson, who served as mayor from 1915 to 1923 and again from 1927 to 1931, was a flamboyant and cynical politician who understood the value of Capone's support. In return for his freedom to operate, Capone delivered votes, both through intimidation at the polls and through financial contributions that funded Thompson's campaigns. This political protection ensured that any serious investigation from the local level would be stymied before it could begin. A police chief who became too zealous in pursuing Capone would find himself reassigned or out of a job. A state's attorney who showed ambition to take on the outfit would find his cases falling apart, his witnesses disappearing, and his political career abruptly ended. The judiciary was the final piece of this corrupt triad. Judges could be influenced to dismiss cases, to set impossibly low bail for captured gunmen, or to issue rulings that hindered prosecutors. This three-layered shield, police politics, and the courts made Capone virtually untouchable from within the city and state systems. He had not just bribed individuals, he had co-opted the very institutions designed to stop him, turning the government of Chicago into a subsidiary of his criminal corporation. This system, however, had one critical vulnerability. It stopped at the city limits. The federal government, specifically the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, operated on a different plane, with agents who were not on the Chicago payroll and were immune to local political pressure. This is why the Satine Valentine's Day Massacre was such a catastrophic miscalculation for Capone. The sheer, horrific spectacle of the killings created a national scandal that demanded a federal response. It galvanized President Hoover and empowered officials like Elmer Eyre and Frank Wilson to pursue their tax case with relentless determination. The local corruption that had protected Capone for so long was useless against federal indictments. Federal judges like James Wilkerson and federal juries that could be imported from outside Cook County. The trial itself was a direct confrontation between this incorruptible federal authority and Capone's localized power. Judge Wilkerson's stunning decision to switch the entire jury panel was the ultimate demonstration of this principle. It was a move that would have been unthinkable in a Cook County courtroom, where the jury list would have been thoroughly compromised by Capone's men. The federal system, with its different procedures and its physical and jurisdictional distance from Chicago, provided a neutral ground where the case could be tried on its merits. The conviction of Al Capone was, therefore, more than just the downfall of a single man. It was a symbolic victory for federal authority over local corruption. It sent a clear message that there was a higher level of law, one that could not be bought or intimidated, and that would ultimately hold even the most powerful criminal accountable. This established a new dynamic in the fight against organized crime, one that continues to this day. While local corruption remains a problem, the primary weapon against sophisticated criminal enterprises is now the federal government. With its vast resources, its ability to prosecute across state lines, and its use of federal statutes like the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the direct descendant of the strategies pioneered in the case against Capone. His downfall, therefore, did not end corruption, but it did prove that no criminal, no matter how well protected they seem at the local level, is beyond the reach of a determined federal government, a lesson that has shaped the landscape of American justice ever since, ensuring that the long arm of the law could indeed stretch into the darkest and most fortified corners of the underworld. The human cost of Al Capone's empire, often obscured by the glamorous sheen of speakeasies and the dramatic tales of gangland shootouts, represents the darkest and most enduring legacy of his reign, a deep and lasting scar on the city of Chicago and the countless individuals whose lives were irrevocably damaged by the violence and corruption he cultivated. This toll can be measured not just in the bodies left in the streets, but in the shattered families, the corrupted youth, and the pervasive climate of fear that became the daily reality for ordinary citizens. The most direct and visible cost was, of course, the death toll. While the exact number of murders attributable to the gang wars of the 1920s is impossible to pinpoint, estimates run into the hundreds. These were not just the deaths of rival gangsters, men who had chosen a life of violence. They included police officers killed in the line of duty, like Officer Harold Olson, who was gunned down while raiding a Capone-owned brewery. They included innocent bystanders, like the child killed by a stray bullet during a street ambush, a tragic and common occurrence in the neighborhoods where the gangs battled for supremacy. The violence was not merely lethal, it was theatrical and designed to terrorize. The public execution of 7 men on St. Valentine's Day was the most extreme example, but bombings of businesses and homes were a frequent tool of intimidation, spreading fear far beyond the immediate targets. For every person killed, there were dozens more who were beaten, maimed, or traumatized, living with the constant, low, great anxiety that their city was a battlefield where they were merely collateral damage. This environment normalized violence for an entire generation, coarsening the social fabric and teaching a dangerous lesson about the uses of power. Beyond the physical violence was the more insidious damage of systemic corruption. When a police officer accepts a bribe to look the other way, when a judge dismisses a case for political reasons, when a mayor openly allies himself with a gangster, the public's trust in its fundamental institutions is eroded. This erosion creates a cynicism that can last for generations, a belief that the system is rigged, that justice is for sale, and that the law does not apply equally to everyone. For the honest citizens of Chicago, this was a profound betrayal. They paid their taxes, they obeyed the laws, and they watched as gangsters flaunted their wealth and power, protected by the very people sworn to uphold the law. This created a sense of powerlessness and disillusionment that was as damaging as any bullet, fostering an environment where criminality could flourish because the social contract between the people and their government had been broken. The victims of Capone's empire also included those who were exploited by his business practices. The prostitution rings he controlled trapped countless young women in a cycle of addiction and abuse, their lives treated as a mere commodity for profit. The loan sharking operations preyed upon the desperate, trapping them in a spiral of debt from which they could never escape, using the threat of brutal violence to ensure repayment. Even his bootlegging business, often romanticized as supplying a public demand, had a dark side. The alcohol itself was often poorly made and sometimes dangerously contaminated, leading to illness, blindness, and even death for those who consumed it. The speakeasies, while vibrant social centers, were also hubs for other vices and were often owned by men who had no qualms about using violence to control their employees or their customers. And then there were the children, the generation growing up in this environment. For them, figures like Capone were not distant criminals. They were local celebrities, men of power and influence who proved that success could be achieved outside the confines of the law. They saw the flashy cars, the expensive clothes, the deference shown to these men, and for some, it became an attractive alternative to the hard, honest labor of their immigrant parents. Capone's reign, therefore, did not just claim lives in the present, it poisoned the future, shaping a worldview for many young people that celebrated illicit success and mocked conventional morality. The human cost of his empire is the story of a city held hostage, not just by fear of violence, but by the corruption of its soul, a process where the lines between right and wrong were blurred, where the criminal was king, and where the ordinary virtues of honesty, hard work, and respect for the law seemed like a fool's game. This is the true legacy of Al Capone, a legacy far more profound and troubling than the myth of the charming gangster, a reminder that the price of such unchecked power is always paid in the currency of human suffering, a debt that continues to be felt long after the tyrant has fallen, echoing through the generations in a silent testament to the damage one man can inflict when ambition is utterly divorced from conscience. The medical mystery surrounding Al Capone's final years, specifically the nature and progression of the syphilis that ultimately destroyed him, offers a grim and clinically fascinating postscript to his violent life, a biological reckoning that was as merciless as any gangland execution. The disease, Treponema pallidum, is believed to have been contracted by Capone in his youth, most likely during his time as a bouncer and procurer in the brothels of Brooklyn and Coney Island. In the early 20th century, treatments for syphilis were primitive and often ineffective, consisting primarily of mercury and arsenic-based compounds like salvarsan, which were toxic and only targeted the early stages of the infection. It is probable that Capone either never sought proper treatment or received inadequate care, allowing the bacterium to lie dormant in his body for years, silently propagating and slowly migrating to his central nervous system. This latent stage can last for decades, giving no outward sign of the devastation to come, which explains why Capone was able to function at the peak of his mental and strategic powers throughout the 1920s. The first significant public signs that something was amiss emerged during his trial in 1931, where observers noted he sometimes seemed distracted and lethargic, attributes that were likely the first subtle neurological symptoms of the disease's progression into its tertiary or late stage. However, it was the immense psychological stress of his conviction, the loss of his empire, and the brutal regimentation of prison life, first in Atlanta and then in the oppressive isolation of Alcatraz, that likely acted as a catalyst, accelerating the disease's final, catastrophic assault on his brain. The condition that ultimately claimed his mind is known as general paresis or neurosyphilis, which occurs when the spirochete bacteria invade the brain and spinal cord, causing widespread inflammation, tissue death, and a progressive, irreversible dementia. The symptoms Capone began to display in Alcatraz are a textbook case of general paresis. They started with personality changes and mood swings. The once calculating and controlled strategist became emotionally volatile, prone to unprovoked rage, as seen in the scissors attack on a fellow inmate, and also to periods of childish euphoria. This was followed by a noticeable decline in his cognitive functions. His famed sharpness and memory began to fail him. He became disoriented in familiar surroundings, and his speech became slurred and at times incoherent. He suffered from grandiose delusions, at times believing he was still running his criminal empire or that he was someone else entirely. Physically, he developed tremors, particularly in his hands, which made it impossible for him to play the banjo. One of his few prison pleasures, his gait became unsteady and shuffling, and he experienced debilitating headaches and transient episodes of paralysis. The prison doctors, initially suspecting psychosis or malingering, eventually diagnosed him with general paresis, a death sentence in that era. The disease was untreatable. The medical science of the 1930s had no answer for it. The famous penicillin treatment for syphilis, discovered by Alexander Fleming, would not become widely available until after World War II, tragically too late for Capone. His transfer out of Alcatraz to a terminal island, and finally his release were admissions that the prison system was now merely housing a helpless invalid, not a fearsome criminal. The final years at his Palm Island estate were a slow, undignified unraveling. The man who had commanded the Chicago underworld was reduced to a state of infantile dependency, requiring constant care, often unaware of his own identity or his surroundings. The syphilis had systematically erased his personality, his memories, and his very consciousness, leaving behind a hollow shell. His death from cardiac arrest in 1947 was simply the final biological failure of a body that had been under siege for years. In a cruel twist of fate, the disease had also been passed congenitally to his son, Sonny, who suffered from related health issues throughout his life, a lasting physical legacy of his father's youthful indiscretions. The story of Capone's illness is a stark, sobering reminder of the limits of power. For all his wealth, his influence, and his capacity for violence, he was ultimately brought down not by a rival's bullet or a prosecutor's argument, but by a microscopic organism, a consequence of his own past actions that waited patiently in the shadows of his body for decades before emerging to claim its final, terrible price, demonstrating that even the most formidable of men are ultimately subject to the indifferent and unforgiving laws of biology. As the dust of history settled over the saga of Al Capone, the narrative inevitably fragmented into a multitude of perspectives, each interpreting his life and legacy through a different lens, creating a complex and often contradictory portrait that continues to be debated by historians, sociologists, and the public to this day. The historical perspective, grounded in court records, newspaper archives, and official documents, presents Capone as a pivotal figure in the evolution of American organized crime, a transitional character who bridged the era of disorganized street gangs and the rise of the sophisticated, corporate-style syndicate. Historians point to his role in formalizing the structure of the outfit, his understanding of public relations, and his catastrophic miscalculation in attracting federal attention as key factors that shaped the future of the underworld. They see his downfall as a landmark event in the expansion of federal power, proving the efficacy of financial investigations and tax law as weapons against powerful criminals who were otherwise untouchable by local authorities. From this viewpoint, he is a case study in the dynamics of power, corruption, and the ultimate limitations of criminal ambition. The sociological perspective, however, digs deeper, examining Capone not just as an individual, but as a product and a symptom of his time. He emerged from the poverty and marginalization of the immigrant experience, a classic example of blocked opportunities leading to illicit innovation. Prohibition, a well-intentioned but deeply flawed social experiment, created a vacuum of power and a golden opportunity that a man of his talents and lack of scruples was perfectly positioned to exploit. Sociologists argue that he was, in a sense, created by the hypocrisy of a nation that outlawed alcohol while its citizens' demand for it remained insatiable. He was the dark embodiment of the Roaring Twenties, ethos of rebellion against traditional values, a symbol of a society grappling with rapid modernization, urbanization, and shifting moral codes. In this light, Capone becomes less a monstrous anomaly and more a reflection of the contradictions and tensions within American society itself, a manifestation of the dark side of the American dream, where the pursuit of success justifies any means. This sociological interpretation bleeds into the realm of myth and popular culture, where the historical Capone has been largely replaced by an archetype, a symbol whose meaning is flexible and endlessly reinvented. In the decades following his death, he has been portrayed as a tragic Shakespearean figure, a ruthless monster, a charming rogue, and a folk hero. This transformation began almost immediately with the 1932 film Scarface, which, while condemning its protagonist, also reveled in his vitality and rebellious spirit. Over time, as the immediate fear and trauma of his reign faded, the cultural memory softened, focusing increasingly on the glamour and excitement of the speakeasy era while downplaying the brutal reality of his violence. He became a staple of television dramas, comic books, and eventually major Hollywood biopics, each new interpretation adding another layer to the myth. This process of myth making serves several functions for the public. It allows for a safe engagement with themes of power, rebellion, and transgression. It transforms a terrifying historical reality into a manageable, entertaining narrative. And it reflects a perennial public fascination with the figure of the outlaw, the individual who lives outside the rules of society. The myth of Capone also serves as a convenient scapegoat, a singularly evil figure onto which the systemic failures and widespread moral compromises of the Prohibition era can be pinned, allowing society to avoid a more uncomfortable examination of its own complicity. The real Al Capone, the man who suffered from syphilis, who had a wife and son, who was capable of both genuine charm and utter ruthlessness, is now inaccessible, buried forever beneath the weight of his own legend. He has become a blank canvas upon which subsequent generations project their own anxieties and fantasies about power, crime, and success. The enduring fascination with him lies in this very duality. He is both a specific historical person and a universal symbol, a man whose story can be told as a crime thriller, a morality tale, a sociological study, or a tragic drama. This multifaceted legacy ensures that he will never be forgotten, but it also guarantees that the true, complex humanity of the man will forever be obscured by the towering, and often misleading, shadow of the myth he worked so hard to create and that the world has been so eager to consume. A final, ironic twist in a life defined by the manipulation of image and reality. And so, the story of Alphonse Gabriel Capone reaches its final, quiet conclusion, not with a thunderous shootout, but with the fading echo of a life that serves as one of the most profound and enduring cautionary tales in the annals of American history. From the crowded, hopeful tenements of Brooklyn to the opulent, paranoid fortress of his Palm Island estate, his journey traces the volatile arc of a corrupted dream. We have followed his rise from a clever, ambitious street thug to the strategic understudy of Johnny Torrio, and finally to his self-coronation as the undisputed Godfather of Chicago, a ruler who built a multi-million-dollar empire on the simple, brilliant, and brutal exploitation of a nation's failed moral experiment. We have witnessed the mechanics of his power, the sophisticated bootlegging operation, the web of corruption that ensnared an entire city, and the calculated use of terror that culminated in the horrific spectacle of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, an act that simultaneously marked the peak of his power and the beginning of its irrevocable erosion. We have seen his monumental pride and his fatal miscalculation, his belief that his influence was infinite, that he could charm the public and intimidate the law into submission. And we have observed his stunning downfall, orchestrated not by a rival's bullet, but by the quiet, relentless work of federal accountants who proved that even a king could be dethroned by the mundane power of a tax form. His final years present a tragic and harrowing portrait of physical and mental decay. A king stripped of his crown, his mind, and finally his life, not by the justice of man, but by the biological justice of a disease born from his own world of vice. His legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of violence and charity, of charismatic charm and utter ruthlessness, of corporate innovation and primitive savagery. He left behind a transformed criminal underworld that learned from his mistakes and retreated into the shadows, a federal law enforcement apparatus empowered and emboldened by his conviction, and a cultural myth that continues to fascinate and repel in equal measure. But beyond the myth and the historical analysis, his story endures as a powerful and universal parable about the nature of power itself. It demonstrates that power gained through fear and corruption is inherently unstable, a fortress built on sand that will inevitably be washed away by the tides of time, justice, or its own internal contradictions. It warns of the intoxicating and ultimately destructive nature of absolute ambition, showing how the pursuit of power can hollow out a man, leaving him isolated, paranoid, and vulnerable. And most importantly, it reaffirms a fundamental, hopeful principle that no individual, no matter how wealthy, powerful, or feared, is truly above the law, The system may be slow, it may be flawed, but the case of Al Capone stands as a monumental testament to its ultimate resilience. His life is a dark star in the American firmament, a reminder of the chaos that ensues when the rule of law is supplanted by the rule of the ruthless, and a permanent warning of the high price, both personal and societal, of a life lived without conscience. This concludes our comprehensive journey into the life and times of Al Capone. We have striven to present a complete and accurate account, pieced together from the vast historical record, with the sole intention of bringing the correct information directly to you. We hope this deep exploration has been as enlightening for you as it has been for us to compile. The story of the Godfather of Chicago is a stark reminder that history's greatest lessons are often found in its darkest chapters. If you have found this journey through one of history's most compelling true crime sagas valuable, if you believe in the importance of unearthing the past and presenting the facts, then we invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Your engagement is what fuels this channel and allows us to continue delving into the stories that shaped our world. Please show your support by subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell so you will not miss our next foray into the depths of history. We are dedicated to being your source for thorough, engaging, and factual historical narratives. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to understanding the past. This has been the story of Al Capone.